or held on to the rope of Allah that never breaks. Because when Allah tells us to hold on to the rope of Allah, that rope is none other than the Prophet ﷺ himself. Even if we were to say that it was Quran. The Quran was revealed to the Prophet ﷺ, and the only way the Sahaba had access to the Quran was through the Prophet ﷺ. It's only now that we can go to the shop, pick up a book, and we say this is the Quran and read it. But in the time of the Sahaba, the only way they knew the Quran was through the Prophet ﷺ. There was no physical book. He was the book. And that's why when Aisha was asked what was the character of the Prophet ﷺ, she said, كَانَ خُلُقُهُ الْقُرْآنِ, that his character was the Quran. He was the Quran manifest in a human being. And his words, his recitation was the Quran. There was a Sahaba called Abdullah ibn Mas'ud. He said, I memorized over 50 verses, 50 chapters of the Quran just from hearing the Prophet ﷺ recite them in Salah. He never sat down and went to madrasa and started to read a book to memorize the Quran, but just from attending the masjid, praying behind the Prophet ﷺ, that's how he got the Quran, and that's how most of the Sahaba memorized the Quran. So when we speak about the Quran, the Prophet ﷺ himself is the Quran. When we speak about the Sunnah, his actions and what was done in front of him that he accepted is the Sunnah. So all the ways that we have to reach Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, they all come through the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. So he's the rope of Allah that if we hold on to it, we're holding on to a rope that will never break. Then he says, فَاقَ النَّبِيِّينَ فِي خَلْقٍ وَفِي خُلُقٍ وَلَمْ يُدَانُوهُ فِي الْعِلْمِ وَالْكَرَمِ. He surpassed all of the prophets in his physical attributes and in his character. The word khulq and khuluq both come from the root word khalaqa, which means to create. So it's about the way that you were created. Your khalq is the way that you're physically created, and your khuluq are the attributes that you create for yourself. But the Prophet ﷺ was complete both outwardly and inwardly. If you think about human interaction and human relations, you only incline towards people for one of two reasons, or one of three reasons, but for the sake of this, we'll say one of two reasons. Because they look good, or because they have a good character. So you can see somebody, they're very, very attractive, so you incline towards them. You say, oh wow, this person looks good. And then you want to talk to them, you want to engage with them, you want to interact with them. Or you might see someone, initially they're not attractive to you physically, but when you start to speak to them, they're incredibly funny, they're incredibly kind, they bring you gifts, they help you out, they pour you tea, they do all of the things that make you happy. So you want to spend time with this person because their character pleases you. It might not be their physical appearance that pleases you, but their character pleases you. So when Allah wanted to create a prophet that would come and call people towards him, he needed to make the Prophet ﷺ the most appealing that he could be. So he perfected the Prophet ﷺ's physical form, and then he perfected the Prophet ﷺ's character as well. And so if we think about all of the people that had been chosen to call to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, which are the prophets, the Prophet ﷺ has surpassed all of them in his physical characteristics and in his character. It was said that Yusuf alayhi salam was given half of all beauty, nisful jamal. And Aisha radiallahu anha said, if the women who were the friends of the wife of Pharaoh, who when they saw Yusuf, they cut their hands because they were in awe of how beautiful he was. He said, if they had seen the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, they would have cut their hearts. The scholars, when they say that he had been given half of all beauty, they say he had been given half of all of the beauty that was given to the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. To the point that one of the poets, Hassan ibn Thabit, one day he looked at the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam and he said, وَأَجْمَلُ مِنْكَ لَمْ تَرَى قَطُّ عَيْنِي وَأَحْسَنُ مِنْكَ لَمْ تُلِدَ النِّسَاء خُلِقْتَ بَرَاءً مِنْ كُلِّ عَيْبٍ كَأَنَّكَ خُلِقْتَ كَمَا تَشَاءُ. He looked at him, he said, I've never seen anybody more beautiful than you. And this is a man looking at another man and telling him, I've never seen anybody more beautiful than you. He said, and a woman has never given birth to anyone that is better than you. He said, you have been created and made free from all imperfections, as if Allah had allowed you to be created the way you chose. If we all look at ourselves, we might like the way we look, but we know that there's something we would change about the way we look. So you look in the mirror, you say, oh, I feel like my nose is a bit too big, or I feel like my eyes are a bit too bulgy, or you feel like, whatever it is, we all have imperfections and insecurities about our appearance, which is why people go and do plastic surgery, people wear makeup, people do all of these things to change the way that they look. But Hassan ibn Thabit was saying to the Prophet ﷺ, you look so perfect that it's as if when Allah was creating you, he asked you to choose how you wanted to look. Because if all of us could choose how we would look, we'd create ourselves to be the best version of ourselves that we could be. Someone on this trip the other day, I was showing him one of my friends. He said, this guy looks like a Giga Chad. I never heard that word before in my life. But I think it's a word, you know, there's like a archetype of man that they call a Chad. Then Giga is like the super version of that. So it's like, the guy looks good, he looks like a Giga Chad. He looks like what's the word? An archetype. You know, you have these like Superman looks like this, etc. Characters that people have drawn to highlight all of the different ways that a human being could be perfect or look perfect. The Prophet ﷺ was created with those attributes. Maybe on another trip or maybe on another time, there's a book called Shama'il Muhammadiyah by Imam al-Tirmidhi, where he gathered around 200 and something hadith that just describe the physical attributes of the Prophet ﷺ and parts of his character as well. But it's more about giving you the image of knowing what the Prophet ﷺ looked like. So for us, when we started studying hadith with our teacher, he taught us the Arba'in al-Nawawi first. Well, before that even, there's a hadith called al-Hadith al-Musalsal bil-Awwaliyah, which is meant to be the first hadith that you hear from your teacher. And then after that we did Arba'in al-Nawawi, the 40 hadith of Imam Nawawi. And then he said we have to study the Shama'il, because the Shama'il gives you a complete image of who the Prophet ﷺ was. So when you now go into the other hadith books like Al-Muwatta, Bukhari, Muslim, etc., you will have an image of who this person is that you're talking about, sallallahu alayhi wasallam. But his physical description, he was known to have been not too tall and not too short, not too black and not too white. They said he's not Adam, which means extremely black, and he's not Abyad Amhaq, he's not extremely white, he was somewhere in between. They said his hair wasn't too kinky, but it wasn't too straight, it was wavy, it was somewhere in the middle. So the Prophet ﷺ was given, you know, moderation in everything, and that his shoulders were extremely wide, and his chest was in line with his stomach, so he didn't have the uncle belly that we all are used to the ulama having. The Prophet ﷺ's stomach was flat to the point that it was in line with his chest, and he had a thin layer of hair that went in between his chest all the way down to his navel. And his hands were very thick and chunky, and his legs were very thick and chunky. And he was a sturdy person, and he used to walk. There's a very, very long hadith. The best hadith that describe the Prophet ﷺ in that book are the hadith of Anas ibn Malik and Ibn Abi Hala. Ibn Abi Hala is interesting because the hadith that's narrated from him, Imam Hassan or Imam Hussein, one of them, the grandsons of the Prophet ﷺ, said, I went to my uncle, Khali ibn Abi Hala, and asked him to describe the Prophet ﷺ for me. So for people who don't know who he is, you'll be confused. How is this man the uncle of Imam al-Hussein or Imam al-Hassan? People don't remember that the Khadija, the wife of the Prophet ﷺ, was married twice before she married the Prophet ﷺ. And she had children from those marriages. And from amongst the children that she had was this man, Ibn Abi Hala. And so he was the uncle of Hassan and Hussein because Fatima was his younger sister and the Prophet ﷺ was his stepfather. So when the Prophet ﷺ married his mother, he grew up with the Prophet ﷺ, and he was extremely eloquent, so he was able to describe the Prophet ﷺ because he was older than all of the Prophet ﷺ's kids. Imagine if Khadija was 40 and he was 25, the Prophet ﷺ, when he married Khadija. Let's say if Khadija had got married at the age of 20 or even 15, because they would get married as early as 15. The child that she had would have been a teenager by the time, or at least would have been in his pre-teens by the time the Prophet ﷺ came to the house. So the child was very familiar with the Prophet ﷺ. And it also shows, because you sometimes, stepchildren don't even like their stepfathers. But he had such an amazing relationship with the Prophet ﷺ that he believed in him, he followed him, he became a Sahaba, and he narrates some of the best hadith about him. So it shows that even before Islam, the Prophet ﷺ had an impeccable character because his stepson was speaking highly of him after he had passed away and was praising him. And Anas ibn Malik and Ali ibn Abi Talib, those were the people that described the Prophet ﷺ the best. And it's interesting as well because if you look at Shama'il Muhammadiyah, all of the hadith that describe the Prophet ﷺ are narrated by Sahaba who were children around the Prophet ﷺ because of two reasons. The men who were the same age as the Prophet ﷺ were so in awe of him that they couldn't sit in his presence and stare at him and analyze him properly because he had such a strong presence. You know, like if you meet someone you respect, you get starstruck, you get shy, you don't really interact with them to the level that you could. But you know, kids, they're not scared of anyone, they don't respect anyone. They'll come, they'll sit on your lap, they'll pull your beard, they'll play with you, they'll tell you you smell, they'll tell you anything that's on their mind, they'll tell you. There was a story once, a child went missing. There was a lion on the loose and it was killing people in the village. And so one of the children of the village went missing and the parents of the child got scared and they said, let's go and look for our child. I'm sure the lion's got him. So they went into the forest and they saw the lion in the distance playing with their child. And the lions looked at the village people far away and realized that this is the child of the village people there. The village people were too scared to come close, but the child was there playing with them. And the lion looked at the other lion, the male lion looked at the female lion and he said, you see, he said, the adults are staying far away from us because they know who we are. He said, but the child doesn't know how dangerous we are. That's why he's here playing with us. So the Prophet ﷺ was like that. So you see that all of the hadith that describe him properly in terms of his physical characteristics, etc., were all the children around him. Anas ibn Malik came to him when he was 10 years old, and he served him for 10 years until he passed away. When he passed away, Anas was 20 years old. So he was a teenager around the Prophet ﷺ. So he didn't have that awe of the Prophet ﷺ the same way that the other Sahaba did. Ali ibn Abi Talib was raised by the Prophet ﷺ from when he was a child until he lived with him in the house of Khadija until he got married to Fatima and he got his own house. And Ibn Abi Hala again, same thing, same situation. The Prophet ﷺ was his stepfather. So these were all children who grew up around the Prophet ﷺ, who narrate about his character. So we don't have time to talk about the excellence of his physical characteristics. That's another class for another time with a different ijazah and a different book. But he surpassed all of the prophets fi khalqin, in the way that he was formed, wa fi khuluqin, and in his character. And we know that the Prophet ﷺ had the best of character. It would suffice us to just narrate the hadith where the Prophet ﷺ said, إِنَّمَا بُعِثْتُ إِلَّا لِيُتَمِّمُ مَكَارِمُ الْأَخْلَاقِ, that I was not sent except to perfect good character. It suffices us to think about the fact that his name is Muhammad, the one that is praised. But if we look in the entire Quran, Allah only praises him once. And when he praises him, what does he say? إِنَّكَ لَعَلَىٰ خُلُقِ الْعَظِيمِ. Verily, you have an excellent character. You're on an exalted standard of character. So the only thing Allah praises about the Prophet ﷺ is his akhlaq. And the reason for that is because that's the only thing we can try and copy. We can't try and look as good as the Prophet ﷺ looked. That's a matter of genetics. If you lost that lottery, you lost it. But you can try and imitate the Prophet ﷺ's character. And he was sent to us as a good example. Allah tells us in the Quran, لَقَدْ كَانَ لَكُمْ فِي رَسُولِ اللَّهِ أُسْوَةٌ حَسَنَةٌ. You have a good example in the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam.